Hello and welcome to Religious Studies 100. The topic for today's class is miracles. This is the first part of our discussion, and we will most likely continue with it in our next lecture. At the beginning of the semester, I said that there are three elements in most religious traditions, most definitely in Western religious traditions, which are central to each of these traditions. And these elements are the mystical, which has to do with the intimate relationship between the individual and God, the transcendent power. The prophetic, which has to do with involvement with social causes, struggle to implement God's will, or what once believed to be God's will in the temporal order. And finally, the miraculous, the wonderful, but it could be considered an outright revelation from heaven. Well, today, finally, the time has come for discussing the miracles in world religions. We will look at a number of such events in Christianity, some in Catholicism, others in the Orthodox tradition, and in Hinduism, although we will make references to miracles in other religions as well. Now, let me make very clear what the purpose of this part of our class is, of our discussion. This is not to convince you that there are miracles, that God causes miracles, performs miracles. Neither to convince you of that or the opposite. Remember, we are looking at religion here in this class as social scientists. We're not trying to convince you of anything. This is not a catechetical class in the Bible or anything like that, okay? We look at religion as a cultural event. So when we talk about miracles, our task here, our first task here is describe what we are talking about. What are those events? Do those events exist? Do they take place? Now, if we come to the conclusion that there are such events, that doesn't necessarily imply that we are saying that God causes them. We're not making a statement as to who or what causes those events. Okay, so our task here is simply to determine whether such events, as religious people call miracles, do in fact exist or not, or are they just the result of misunderstandings or superstitions. But again, if we came to the conclusion that there are such events, that does not necessarily imply we are saying God causes them. First of all, because there are such events, as we will see, in different religions. So if we were to say that the miracles in one religion are the true ones, then we would be saying by implication that the miracles in other religions are false, or the other religions. We're not going to get into those issues. Are there such events? That is what we're going to look at in here. Is there sufficient evidence that such events, as religious people call miracles, do in fact exist? That's our concern. Okay? And if they exist, it's up to the individual to give them an interpretation as to what causes them or who causes them. We're going to be looking at four types of miraculous events. First of all, apparitions of supernatural beings. More specifically, because they play such a major role in Catholicism, we're going to be looking at the so-called apparitions of the Virgin Mary. Healings, cures, miraculous cures. The stigmata and the incorruptible. Although, in the documentary you have to see for this week, which is on your Moodle page, you will see also examples of miracles in Hinduism and in other religious traditions. Of course, we all know of the miracles in the Jewish scriptures, the parting of the Red Sea and stuff like that. Well, the problem is they are too remote in time. It's hard for us to try to gather some evidence as to the real occurrence. So we're going to leave those aside for now. So again, today we're just going to revise, we're going to have a look at those events, and then our next discussion, or next part of the next part of this discussion, will be to see what philosophers and scientists say about them. So let's begin with apparitions. We're going to be discussing specifically two types of apparitions. Actually, I shouldn't say types, but three examples of Marian apparitions in Catholicism. The first one is that of Lourdes in southern France. You have to read for this part of the course a book on Lourdes, a book about Lourdes, about the healings of Lourdes, kind of a scientific approach to it with medical records and stuff like that. But the book doesn't give you any description of the apparitions or what was it that started that event. So we're going to look at that today here. The historical event is that Bernadette Soubirous, a French peasant girl of about 14, 15 years of age, in 1858 claimed to have seen an apparition of a young lady resplendent with light who spoke to her in the countryside close to the town where she lived, in Lourdes. And she received a number of apparitions, about 18, over a period of several months. And of course, as soon as she reported that, large crowds of people gathered around her to witness these events of the apparitions. She claimed to see the lady, no one else did. But whenever she was in ecstasy, she couldn't feel anything. She was checked by doctors, and they would put flames and candles or needles and try to pinch her, and she wouldn't feel it. She would be completely in a state of ecstasy, as it's known. And then at one particular occasion, she claimed that the lady told her to dig on the ground with her fingers, which she did in front of everyone, and then a spring of water popped up out of the surface of the ground. And that's the famous spring of Lourdes, the famous water of Lourdes. People began drinking of that water, and they claimed to be cured of a number of serious diseases. Back then, it was mostly tuberculosis. Today, there are still large pilgrimages that go to Lourdes every year. In fact, Lourdes in southern France is the #1 place of international pilgrimage in the world, more than Mecca for Muslims, with about 5 million pilgrims going there every year. And people go there in part for the water. There are large pilgrimages of sick people. And there are a number of healings that still take place. You have read about those cures and the process that it takes for a cure to be declared miraculous. There are first 2 medical commissions, one right there in situ at Lourdes itself, that admits a cure for a study or dismisses it right from the start. If it is taken out for a study, then it's sent to a second international medical commission made up of doctors, not necessarily Catholic doctors or even Christians in any way, but just specialists in that particular disease. And if all of the records, all of the medical records are in place, and the certifications that show that the disease was terminal, there was no possible cure for it, and that the cure happened instantly and leaving no trace, then the medical commission will issue a certification of a medically unexplainable cure. And that medically unexplainable cure will then go on to another commission, to a church commission this time, which will study all of these certifications and see if other conditions that they have are also met. And if all of the conditions are met, then they will declare the cure to be miraculous. Okay? Many cures take place at Lourdes that never make it to the declaration of miraculous. sometimes simply because documentation is missing. Or even if the documentation is missing, maybe the Church Commission may have some doubts. So far, about 65 cures have been declared miraculous, but there are many other medically unexplainable cures connected to the water of Lourdes. Let me read for you now a description given by the visionary, by Bernadette, to the police when the events were taking place at the time. She says, I had hardly, and the language is a little funny, a little literary. Of course, a peasant girl wouldn't speak like this, but the translation comes out as a little wordy. I had hardly begun to take off my stocking when I heard the sound of the wind, as in a storm. I turned towards the meadow, and I saw that the trees were not moving at all. I went on taking my stockings off, and was putting one foot into the water when I heard the same sound in front of me. I looked up and saw a cluster of branches and brambles underneath the topmost opening of the grotto, tossing and swaying to and fro, though nothing else stirred all around. Behind these branches and within the opening, I saw immediately afterwards a girl in white, no bigger than myself, who greeted me with a slight bow of the head. At the same time, she stretched out her arms slightly away from her body, opening hands as in pictures of Our Lady. Over her right arm hung a rosary. She was wearing a white dress reaching down to her feet, of which only the toes appeared. The dress was gathered very high at the neck by a hem from which hung a white cord. A white veil covered her head and came down over her shoulders and arms almost to the bottom of her dress. On each foot I saw a yellow rose. The sash of the dress was blue and hung down below her knees. The chain of the rosary was yellow, the beads white, big and widely spaced. The girl was alive, very young and surrounded with light. When I had finished my rosary, she bowed to me smilingly. She retired within the niche and disappeared all of a sudden. That was the first silent apparition. In the next instances of this visionary event, there are conversations between Bernadette and the lady. Okay, that as far as the Lourdes events. The next event I want to discuss is Fatima. So let me write this down here. Fatima is a little town in central Portugal where another major Marian apparitional event took place, this time in 1917, during the time of World War I. 3 young shepherds, very young, in their early teens, or even younger, one of them, 2 girls and 1 boy, Lucy, Jacinta, and Francisco, again claimed that this beautiful young lady had appeared to them and that she wanted them to go back to that place on the 13th of each month. This began on May 13th, and that on the 13th of October, excuse me, she would reveal to them who she was. Let me read again from their report to the police how the first instance of the apparition was described by the children. Excuse me. So the children had just finished their lunch and they had begun to play. Suddenly they noticed a flash of light. Fearing a storm, they rushed to gather the sheep and head for shelter. When another flash, this one more brilliant, rooted them to the spot. Then, over the branches of a small holm oak tree, they saw what they described as the most beautiful lady they had ever seen. The lady was described by the children as incredibly beautiful, a girl of about 16, so resplendent with light that it dazzled their eyes. She was clothed in a garment of pure white, which fell in soft folds to her feet, and was adorned with a star near the hem of her long flowing robe. The lady smiled upon the three children with a very warm expression, and then the following dialogue took place between Lucy and the lady. "Where do you come from?" "I come from heaven." "And why have you come down here?" "Because I want you children to come here on the 13th of each month at the same hour. In the month of October, I shall tell you who I am and what I want you to do." But Lucy wanted to know more. "Do you really come from heaven? Shall I go to heaven too?" "Yes, you will go there." "And Jacinta?" "Jacinta will go to heaven too." "And Francisco?" The lady looked earnestly at the child. "Yes, Francisco too will go to heaven. But he will first have to pray many rosaries." Apparently the boy wasn't as good as the girls. So, again, we have the crowds gathering at each of these apparitional events, and especially, of course, on October 13th, when the announcement had been made that a special sign would be given by the lady that she was actually appearing. And when you watch a documentary for this week, you will see what happened. And you will see pictures of what happened on October 13th in 1917. Associated to Fatima, there are a number of secrets that the lady supposedly told the children. Among them, that there would be a war, bigger war after the war that was taking place back then. That two of the children would die soon, which happened. They died within 1 year. And then a third secret, which was kept secret for a long, long, long time, and finally revealed by the Pope, the previous Pope, Pope John Paul II, at Fatima during a visit he made in the year 2000, and that you can find on the internet, the famous third secret of Fatima. Again, the third instance of apparitional events in Catholicism that I'd like to discuss is that of Guadalupe in Mexico. These events took place in the 16th century, the 1500s. Here the main character is an Indian, a peasant Indian called Juan Diego. Who claimed that a beautiful young lady had appeared to him in the countryside as he was going to Mexico City, and that had told him to go and see the bishop and tell him that she wanted a church built on that spot and people to go on pilgrimage there. Juan Diego, being a peasant Indian, didn't dare to go and talk to the bishop, who was a very important man back then, of course. So he asked the lady to give him some sign that he could show to the bishop. In fact, he went and talked to the bishop the first time. But the bishop said, well, tell the lady to give you some sign that she's really appearing to you. So the next time, on his way back, the lady appeared to him again. And he said, look, the bishop says he wants a sign. Please give me some sign. The bishop will not believe me again if I go there. And so she said, as the story goes, she told him to go and pluck some roses that were nearby, and put them in his mantle, fold his mantle with the roses inside, and just take them to the bishop, which he did. And so when he finally met the bishop, he had difficulties getting to the bishop the second time, but when he finally got to the presence of the bishop, the bishop asked him, well, do you have any proof from this lady? He said, yes, I have some roses he asked me to bring for you. And as he opened the mantle, the image of the Virgin Mary, of a young lady, was imprinted in the mantle itself. And that mantle still exists. It hasn't deteriorated, which is part of the mystery. And after 500 years, and is revered in Mexico, it's become an icon. Sorry, it's become an icon. And we need to. So after 500 years, that mantle with this mysterious image imprinted in it has become an icon for Mexicans. And I'm sure you've seen it in any Mexican party or event or demonstration. I have a copy of it now here that I'll show you. So in this image, what we see is a young lady. That's the image that was imprinted. And then the original image was ornamented with all these rays. It was adorned with all these rays and stuff, and the little angels. None of this was in the original image. It was painted. This is painted. However, the image itself is not painted. What appears is that the very fabric of the cloth took on that color. So that's part of the mystery of the image. Everything else we know is painted, and we can see the paint, and we can scratch it. But in the image itself, we don't see paint. That's part of the enigmatic nature of this image. So that's Our Lady of Guadalupe. Okay, so that as far as apparitions. Concerning healings, I'm not going to say much because you already read the book about the cures of Lourdes, and you see what the requirements are for a cure to be accepted for study. The cure must be of a lethal disease, terminal, for which there is no medical cure. The cure must be instantaneous and leave no trace, and it may not reappear within 15 years. Normally, it never reappears. Today, fewer and fewer cures are taken up for study, are accepted for study at Lourdes, cures that take place in connection with the water of Lourdes. Not because fewer cures happen, but because most diseases can be treated. And so if there is a treatment for a disease, it will not be accepted for study. It has to be something like cancer, terminal cancer, or AIDS, or some other disease for which there is no cure, and in its final terminal stage, when the cure happens, and it's sudden, instantaneous, and leaves no trace. And it has to be fully documented. So it's a pretty serious thing. It's not a matter of a misunderstanding or self-suggestion. I mean, we know the kinds of things that are possible with the placebo effect or through self-suggestion. And no cancer cure or cure of any major terminal disease has been achieved through self-suggestion, and much less instantaneously and leaving no trace. So we are dealing with some serious stuff in here. The next example of miraculous event I'd like to discuss are the stigmata. You will see a case of stigmata as well in the documentary for this week. The stigmata are the wounds that appear on a person's body that resemble those of crucifixion. So a stigmatic, a person who received the stigmata, will suddenly develop bloody wounds in the palm of their hands, in their forehead, like resemble the crown of thorns, in their chest, and in their feet, as they undergo some terrible suffering. And this happens usually like on Good Friday, which is when Christians commemorate crucifixion. And as I said, you have an example, a videotaped example of stigmata in the documentary for this week. The stigmatics are taken to hospitals when this happens, And there is a medical label for it, which is the syndrome of astigmatism, but it doesn't really explain anything. There are no really scientific explanations for it. The stigmata appear for a few hours, and then as quickly as they appear, disappear. So there are superficial wounds and superficial bleeding, but very profuse bleeding, accompanied by suffering of a very mysterious sort. And this has been happening for centuries to different people. It still happens today. And in the documentary, you will see how a team of UCLA doctors went to study the case of astigmatic and what their perplexity was when they saw it like and what they said. And finally, the last instance of miraculous event that I'd like to discuss today are the incorruptible. The incorruptibles are bodies of people who led usually a saintly life and who, after they died, their body did not decay. It remained as if they were alive, as if they were sleeping. Okay? There are quite a number of those too. And precisely, a very striking case is that of the girl who received the apparitions at Lourdes. This girl, after the apparitions ended, went on to become a nun. She lived till age 34, and after she died, her body remained incorrupt. And it can be seen today in a glass coffin in a church in northern France. And I'm going to show you some pictures. And it's truly striking. She's been dead for about 150 years almost, and her body is as if she were sleeping pretty much. Let me show you. Let me bring it closer to the students and the camera. Good. This is as you can see, it looks like she's taking a nap, but she's been dead for over a century. Okay? Okay. Now, when a person who has led a saintly life or has had special religious experiences, as the case was with Bernadette, dies, the person is buried with no special precautions, just a regular burial. And then the body is exhumed, it's taken out of their coffin 25 years later. If 25 years after having been buried, the body of the person has not decomposed, then it may be considered an incorruptible. But 25 years, of course, is long enough for a body to decompose completely and disappear virtually. So these are the cases that we're going to be dealing here with when discussing the philosophical and especially the scientific approaches to miracles. Thank you very much.